Hey everyone, welcome to the Child Anxiety FAQ podcast. FAQ stands for Frequently Asked Questions, and I'm answering your questions about child and teen anxiety. My name is Dawn Friedman, and I've been working with kids and families for more than 30 years as a preschool teacher, parent educator, family case manager, clinical counselor, and now as the owner and operator of Child Anxiety Support, where I help parents of anxious kids. And this week's question is, should I let my anxious child have a phone? I have had this question from two different people in two different contexts with two very different kids. And both of them, this is a theoretical discussion because their children are too young to have phones. And we were just having a theoretical discussion about kids and screens. This is such a complicated question because, of course, when we're talking about phones, we're generally talking about smartphones. And when we're talking about smartphones, we should also be talking about computers and iPads and all the different ways a child can access the internet. And when we're talking about the internet, we're also talking about a variety of things, including social media and other kinds of media and video games on online game. Anyway, it's a whole lot of stuff. And really, what these parents are talking about and asking are, what do I do for my child around things like algorithms that prize staying on your phone, the addictive nature of the phone, the social opportunities and challenges that come with a phone, strangers on Roblox, bullying friends in text threads, and how do I handle all of this? Wow, these are really big questions. And when you've got anxiety in the mix, it's even bigger. And the answer depends on how old your child is and what is the point of the phone and why are you contemplating the phone and what is their environment around the phone and what are your family's values about phones. But ultimately, our kids are going to need to learn how to navigate the great big complications of life online, of having a very powerful computer in your pocket, and managing the 24-hour nature of communication in the digital age. So rather than tell you yes or no, because as you know, I don't really tell people yes or no, what I do is try to help you figure out decision making and give you information so you can make good decisions for your particular child and your particular family. And I'm going to give you, hopefully, some helpful direction in making those decisions. When we think about anything that worries us about our child, anything that we are trying to manage access to, and this can be phones, it can be social media, it can be video games, it can be TV shows, and it can even be other things like sweets or PG-13 movies or time with friends who maybe aren't so friendly. And that's when I want to talk about the difference between restriction and caution. When I think about restriction, I think about anxiety. Restriction is I cannot let you access this because I am afraid of what might happen. I will not buy you a McDonald's Happy Meal because I am afraid that junk food will make you sick. I am afraid of you watching a violent show. I'm afraid that that will damage you in some way. Restriction, as I'm using it here, is a no discussion, no argument policy. It is just a very black and white decision. It is just a strong no. Caution says, let's think about it. Let's negotiate. Let's revisit. Let's be curious. Now, restriction does not allow for the possibility of good. Caution allows for that possibility. I think about many of the families that I've worked with who would consider themselves on the crunchy end of the spectrum, who are very restrictive when it comes to food. And what this does, what this creates actually is it sets up a forbidden fruit dynamic around certain foods. And I encourage any of you who are curious about this to look at the Ellen Satter theory of food competency. I will link it in the show notes. And Ellen Satter talks about a division of responsibility where the parents take responsibility for the big things like what we eat and when we eat, what we prepare. And then the children are responsible for their own consumption of that food. That might mean that I decide at 6 p.m. we have dinner and it's going to be lasagna and a green salad and, I don't know, a side of garlic bread. And my children get to decide how much of that to eat and what they eat within the context of what I've given them. And that means for some kids, they're going to take apart the lasagna and only eat the cheese on top. And some kids are only going to eat garlic bread. And other kids are going to have a little bit of all of it. That's the division of responsibility. And I think that's a good model for other things that we are inclined to view with some restriction. This does not mean giving 3-year-old a free-for-all of a phone, right? Because we get to decide when the child accesses whatever screens and generally what we're serving on those screens, and then our child gets to decide what to do with their screen time. So that might be for a 3-year-old that you say you can watch Bluey or you can watch Sesame Street, you get the choice. I mean, maybe not a 3-year-old. A 3-year-old's probably happy with whatever you throw on. But as they get older, you want to give them the ability to choose because ultimately we are teaching them to handle their own lives. Remember, we're trying to put ourselves out of a job. So rather than restriction, you may not eat any more bread until you eat those greens I've put in front of you. That's restrictive. Or you may not watch any screens ever, and I'm not going to let you have a play date because they might have screens on. That's restrictive. Instead, we work with caution. If you'd like your child to eat more greens, serve more greens and give them more opportunity and less pressure, because pressure can actually backfire on you. So rather than tell them eat greens because they're good for you, and the research shows when we say things like this is good for you, it actually tastes less good, just give them opportunity and invitation to try greens. Eat your own greens. Model that behavior. Let greens be on the same level as any other food, and kids will eat greens. And if they don't, find other ways to offer them opportunity to eat other foods. And I'll tell you, a lot of kids who don't eat greens grow up to be people who eat greens. It's okay. It's all right. Again, I encourage you to look at Ellen Satter's work. This is the same with screens. We are trying to figure out how to give our children the skills and opportunity to figure out how they want to be a person who lives in this world where screens are a reality. So that's part of it. Caution instead of restriction. The other thing is, remember, you will need to revisit this over time. So your firm rules about social media likely will need to be revisited. Why? Because we don't actually know what it's going to look like in a year, let alone 2 or 3 years, because the digital world is changing very quickly. You might right now have determined that your family is not participating on whatever, or that your child is not participating on whatever. That might change in a year. An example I will give is Instagram. So Instagram is actually a place where a lot of kids might be messaging their small group of friends. So we see Instagram as a social media algorithm that sucks kids in and hits their dopamine. And that is true. But also Instagram is a place where a lot of kids do most of their messaging. And I think part of this is because they are aware their parents are reading their texts and it's harder to access your kid's Instagram and all of these things. Because with Instagram, even if you say, I'm going to follow you on Instagram, that's our rule, kid, a lot of kids will create a Finsta, which basically means an Instagram you don't know about that their friends know about. That is going to happen. Your child is going to want some privacy. And again, we are trying to help them navigate and manage it. And part of that is recognizing they are going to do things we don't know about on their phones. Does that mean zero no phones? No, that means You need to work very hard to build trust in your relationship with your child. That means them trusting you and understanding why you're making the decisions you are, knowing that you respect them and appreciate that they are coming from a different place. That means listening to them when you say absolutely no Discord and they come to you and say, let me explain Discord and how I want to use it and what's going on, and you have a discussion about it. Like, I was using Instagram back there, but a lot of the kids aren't on Instagram anymore either, because these digital native kids are ahead of us as far as it comes to technology. They are always going to be ahead of us. They're always going to be doing things that we didn't expect or know about, which is why it is so important that we work more on the relationship. We create this division of responsibility so that we know they can handle making their own decisions eventually. That means listening to them. That means discussing with them. That means sharing the research with them. And a great place to get the research is childrenandscreens.org. Again, I will link that in the show notes. That distills all the research so you can see what's going on, and it makes it a lot easier to make decisions when you kind of know what you're talking about. One thing the research shows us is that kids want information too. They want help understanding. When we come at them and say, social media, bad, that's not helpful. Instead, we need to say, social media can be bad and it can be good. And we need to be cautious because the people are wanting to make money on the backs of our attention and interest. And so they do a lot of trickery to try to keep us hooked into their social media loop. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about being a smart consumer, because we want our kids to be smart consumers. When they're 27 and no longer under our control, we want to have instilled the skills in them to figure out how to handle whatever comes next, which is going to be beyond our ken. It's going to be something more than Instagram, right? We have no idea, but we know the basic skills are paying attention to how I feel when I'm consuming this, noticing when it derails some of my goals, noticing when it violates my values or makes me question them in ways that are not helpful, notice when it drives poor decision making, like thinking I need to redecorate my entire house because the color schemes have changed. These are conversations we need to have with our kids because they are skills they will use for a lifetime. And that's really what we're talking about when we're talking about should my anxious child have a phone, is how do I give my child these tools and this understanding in a way that is good for them? Remember too, ultimately, you are putting yourself out of a job. So when you make decisions, ask yourself, is this an appropriate step on the way to putting myself out of a job? And you don't want to put yourself out of a job when your child is 12 or 14. We're talking about when they're adults. So is this part of the trajectory? Does this make sense on the way to putting myself out of a job? The other thing I always say in so many contexts is balance is a verb, which means you are going to make mistakes, and that's okay. That's part of balancing. You might let them have a phone too early. You might let them have access to social media too late. You may say yes to an app that later on you realize is really not good and we need to course correct. Modeling that for your child, modeling that balance, modeling that repeated decision making, that curiosity, that caution, not restriction, is important. It's okay for you to make mistakes. It's okay for you to course correct. It's great when you can say to your child, wait, you want TikTok? Before I give you TikTok, I need you to go out there on that children and screens and talk to me about TikTok. I'm going to print some stuff out for you. I'm going to share it with you. And then we're going to talk about TikTok. Let me explain why. It's not because I'm a mean, terrible mother who doesn't trust you. It's let me share with you what I have learned about TikTok and what my concerns are. Let's have an ongoing conversation about it. Let's talk about what I would need to see from you, what levels of maturity before I would say yes to this. Or conversely, what I would need to see in an app to make it an app that I would feel comfortable giving you access to. This is not all or nothing. This is not restriction. This is caution. I hope this has been helpful in starting a discussion. If you felt like you were firmly one side or the other, to give you some more context and some more ways to think about things. And again, in the show notes, I'll put those links to Ellen Satter and to Children and Screens. If you have a question you'd like me to address on the show, please reach out to me. Maybe I'll answer it on the podcast.